Imagine stepping off the battlefield, certain you were on the winning side, only to find yourself staring into the eyes of the enemy and they're offering you food instead of a bullet. This was the reality that many German POWs faced when they were captured by the Americans during World War II. The propaganda they had been raised on painted a picture of America as a decadent, weak nation, an enemy that couldn't stand up to the might of the Third Reich. But the moment they surrendered, the truth hit them like a thunderclap. In their minds, America was supposed to be a country on the verge of collapse. A place of easy living, of lazy citizens, consumed by consumerism and indulgence, incapable of waging a real war. The reality of their capture by the very enemy they had dismissed shattered that illusion. When they first encountered American soldiers, they were prepared for cold, ruthless treatment. They expected rough, humiliating behavior, beatings, chains, or even executions. But instead, they found something utterly bewildering. American soldiers greeted them not with hatred or scorn, but with warmth. "Here," one POW recalled, "they handed us food, water, and even cigarettes. I thought it was a trick. I couldn't understand it. How could they be so human?" At first, many POWs couldn't believe it. They had been conditioned to think of the Americans as soft and morally weak. But when they found themselves treated with respect, even kindness, by the very men they had been taught to hate, they were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Everything they had been told was a lie. This was only the beginning of their shock. They had expected to be prisoners of war. But what they found was far more unsettling: the reality of what America truly was. Imagine being a prisoner, trapped in a foreign land, and instead of the grueling march to your doom, you're offered comfort like a strange kindness in the face of your defeat. For many German POWs, the journey across the Atlantic was their first real introduction to the stark contrast between Nazi propaganda and the reality of the United States. When they were initially captured and escorted aboard the ships bound for America, they had no idea what to expect. They had been warned that they would be treated with contempt by their captors, forced into hard labor, and punished for the atrocities they had committed in the war. What they encountered instead was a bewildering experience. Aboard the ships, POWs found conditions that were far better than what they had expected. They were given ample rations, fresh water, and even bedding luxuries that were unimaginable for the men who had been fighting in the mud and blood of Europe. The Germans were accustomed to the brutal conditions of their own military camps, where prisoners were often treated as expendable and starved for information. But here, on American ships, they were treated like human beings. For many of them, this was the first sign that America wasn't what they had been told it was. One POW later recalled, "At first, I thought it was a trick. I expected the worst, but they gave us food and blankets. I thought maybe we'd be locked away somewhere. But no, we were given space and treated decently. There was no brutality, no humiliation. They were fed hot meals, allowed to sleep on clean bunks, and even given the opportunity to speak with the American soldiers. What baffled them most was how easily the American soldiers interacted with them. Where their German commanders would have expected strict discipline and silence, the Americans spoke to them openly, offering small talks about life back home, joking, and even asking questions about the war. As the journey continued, many of the German POWs began to suspect they were being treated better than they had ever been treated in Europe. Could it be possible? One asked himself. Could they really be this generous? Or is this just some trick to break us down? The truth was that the Germans were not facing the brutal enemy they had expected. They were facing a powerful nation that didn't need to rely on cruelty and fear. America's strength lay not in its mistreatment of prisoners, but in its overwhelming power, its ability to win wars without resorting to savagery. What happens when you, a soldier from a war-torn land, step into a place where food, comfort, and luxury are as common as the air you breathe? For the German POWs arriving in America, the shock was not just in the treatment they received, it was in the overwhelming sight of a world that had been spared the ravages of war. They had seen the ruined cities of Europe, the broken buildings, the smoldering landscapes. But in America, they encountered a country that seemed to be flourishing, untouched by the chaos that consumed the world. The first thing that struck the POWs when they set foot on American soil was the sheer scale of everything. Skyscrapers loomed overhead like giants, roads stretched endlessly, and cities seemed to sparkle with life. They had seen the sprawling countryside of Europe, but nothing prepared them for the immensity of American cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. One POW, upon first seeing a bustling American street, described the scene with awe. It was like stepping into another world. The streets were so clean, so orderly. In Europe, you could hardly walk down a street without seeing rubble, but here was something different. It felt like America had never been touched by war. In contrast to the devastation of Europe, where entire cities had been reduced to ruins, America was a place of abundance. Food was plentiful. Stores were stocked with products the Germans could only dream of. Canned goods, fresh fruits, chocolates, and spices. To the POWs, it felt almost surreal. For years they had lived with rationed meals, often with little more than stale bread and watery soup. But in America, they were given more than enough to eat. One German prisoner recalled his first meal in America. "I thought they had given me too much. A whole plate of food. A full meal. We were used to scraping together whatever we could, but here, they gave us so much, I didn't know what to do with it." It wasn't just the food that shocked them, it was the luxury of everyday life. The clothes Americans wore were clean, neat, and made of fabrics that seemed like pure indulgence compared to the worn-out uniforms the Germans had spent the war in. In Europe, many civilians had long gone without proper clothing, but here in America, people seemed to live in a constant state of comfort. And then, there was the freedom. In Nazi-occupied Europe, people lived under constant surveillance, under the boot of oppressive regimes. But in America, the sense of openness, the ease with which people walked around, the lack of fear, it was an alien concept. No one seemed afraid of the future. The POWs couldn't understand it. How could a country at war with the entire Axis live with such confidence and ease? They had expected to find a nation struggling, teetering on the edge of defeat, but instead, they found a vibrant, self-assured superpower. The contrast could not have been more stark. The more they saw, the more they realized they had underestimated their enemy. America wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. What does it feel like to be a soldier, raised on hatred, only to be greeted by kindness from the very people you were taught to despise? For the German POWs, the most unsettling experience in America was not just the contrast between the devastation they'd left behind in Europe and the thriving, peaceful landscapes of America. It was the hospitality they were shown. In the eyes of many German soldiers, Americans had long been caricatured as weak, materialistic, and undisciplined. Yet from the moment they arrived, they encountered a generosity that defied all their expectations. The first thing that shocked the POWs was the personal connection. They were often greeted not with disdain, but with curiosity, and in some cases, outright warmth. Stories from POWs tell of being offered food, cigarettes, and even personal gifts from American civilians. Many were invited to stay in the homes of everyday Americans. One German soldier recalled, "I was brought into an American family's home. They gave me dinner, treated me like a guest. I thought, this can't be real." What baffled them most was the lack of hierarchy. In the Nazi military, there was a strict code of conduct and authority. Officers were treated with respect, while the lower ranks were kept in line with harsh discipline. But in America, everyone seemed to be treated the same. The Americans didn't care about rank or background. They treated the POWs like fellow humans. Many POWs had been raised in a world where strict rules and military superiority were the foundation of society. They had been taught to believe that the American way was flawed, that democracy and freedom were weak and ineffective. But here they were, receiving genuine kindness, as if they were being treated as equals. For many, this was a moral blow. How could a country that they had been raised to hate, a country they had been taught to see as degenerate, treat them with such compassion? This sense of surprise and confusion lingered for many prisoners. They wondered if the warmth was a trap. Some POWs hesitated at first, thinking the kindness might be a ploy to break their will or make them reveal secrets. But over time, the realization grew. The Americans were treating them with respect because they believed in something they could hardly understand. It wasn't just the soldiers or civilians offering kindness, it was the American way itself that struck them. In Nazi Germany, they had been taught to see the world in stark black and white terms, to view their enemies as inferior. But here, in the heart of America, they were being treated with an unexpected humanity that shook the very foundations of their beliefs. What happens when a defeated soldier looks at the enemy's war machine and realizes he's been fighting a lost cause all along? By the time the German POWs began to understand the scale of America's industrial power, the psychological toll was already taking hold. It was one thing to be taken prisoner by a nation you'd been taught to underestimate, but it was an entirely different thing to witness, firsthand, the absolute strength and organization of the United States. As the POWs were moved across the country to various camps, many had the chance to see the American war effort in action. What they saw shattered their previous beliefs about America's ability to fight. They had been told that the United States was a country of disorganized, lazy civilians who had no stomach for war. Yet, they were now seeing a country that had transformed its entire economy into a war machine capable of producing tanks, planes, and weapons faster than Germany ever could. One POW who worked in an American factory recalled, "I saw how fast they could make tanks. I'd never seen anything like it. In Germany, we had to wait weeks, sometimes months, to get a single tank. But in America, they made them like they were toys, quick and with ease." What was most staggering to the POWs was the sheer scale of American production. Factories stretched as far as the eye could see, humming with the noise of workers and machines. The United States wasn't just making weapons, it was flooding the battlefield with them. The German POWs, who had grown up in a country that prided itself on its military might, now found themselves facing an industrial juggernaut that they couldn't even begin to match. The realization hit hard. The war was already lost for Germany, not because of a lack of courage, but because the Americans simply had the resources, the manufacturing power, and the will to outlast them. What happens when soldiers, trained for battle, are forced to experience the quiet, everyday lives of their enemies? Many of the German POWs were put to work in America's vast labor camps, where they helped with farming or factory labor. For them, it was an opportunity to see America up close, a land they had only ever seen through the lens of propaganda. But what they found was deeply unsettling. The freedom, the openness, and the informality of American life were alien to them. In Nazi Germany, the military hierarchy was rigid, and civilians were expected to defer to the will of the state. But in America, POWs were struck by the equality that existed between civilians and soldiers. They saw factory workers and farmers interacting with the POWs as if they were equals, joking with them, even sharing meals. The relaxed nature of American work life was another revelation. POWs were used to the strict, often harsh regimentation of military life. But here, workers seemed to enjoy their jobs, working in groups without the constant threat of punishment or fear. One POW who worked on an American farm remembered, "We had to work hard, but the people I worked with, they seemed happy. They didn't look over their shoulders for fear of a superior officer." This freedom, the simple ability to live without the constant presence of military authority, was something they could not comprehend. How could a country at war with the Axis powers live so freely, without fear? It was a question that lingered in the minds of many POWs as they spent more time in America working alongside civilians and being exposed to the way of life that the US citizens seemed to take for granted. What happens to a soldier's mind when the world he fought for is completely dismantled and the enemy he was taught to hate suddenly seems human? After the war, many of the German POWs who returned home faced a conflict they never expected. They had been brought up to worship the Nazi regime, to believe that they were fighting for a cause greater than themselves. But their experiences in America had forced them to confront the uncomfortable truth. The war they fought in was not the noble struggle they had been told it was. Returning to a defeated, shattered Germany, many of the POWs found themselves disillusioned with their homeland. They had witnessed firsthand the strength and humanity of the Americans, and now, back in Germany, they saw a nation that had been broken by its own arrogance and propaganda. For some, the experience in America had changed them irreparably. They struggled to reconcile the kindness they had been shown with the barbarity they had witnessed back in Nazi-controlled Europe. Some returned home with a newfound respect for the United States, while others could not escape the deep guilt of their involvement in a brutal, unjust war. What happens when a soldier trained to kill returns home and can no longer believe in the cause he fought for? The German POWs' experience in America left a mark on them that could never be erased. The kindness they had been shown, the strength of America's industrial and military might, and the humanity they encountered on American soil all clashed violently with the image of the country they had been taught to despise. For many, returning to Germany after such a revelation was impossible. How could they explain to their comrades that they had seen a world where freedom and equality were cherished, not feared? How could they justify the war they had fought for, knowing what they now knew about America? The last lingering shock for many German POWs wasn't just about losing the war. It was about losing their beliefs, realizing that everything they had been told about their enemy was wrong. And for many, the true cost of the war wasn't just the lives lost. It was the disillusionment that followed,